I've had this idea in my head of making a crayon-shaped wall pocket for a very long time. So the question is, can this Crayola kit help me finally create it? This is the Crayola Air-Dry Clay Paint and Sculpt Pack. It includes 3 pouches of air-dry clay, 6 washable paint pots, a watercolor palette, 2 brushes, and an idea guide. Instead of making one of the smaller projects shown in the guide, I wanted to use the kit as a starting point for something I've imagined for a while. The plan is a giant Crayola crayon wall pocket with a torn paper wrapper that appears to peel open and reveal a place for flowers. So here's the game plan. I used the cap of a 1993 Crayola wrapping paper tube and a metal water bottle to help mold the 2 parts. I promise I had no idea these 2 parts were going to fit together so well. I'm going to wrap the pieces up to make it easier for the clay to be removed once it's dry. I put down a silicone mat to protect my table while I'm sculpting. I also got a cup of water to smooth down rough edges of the clay. Once I opened the clay, the first thing I noticed was how sticky it felt. Right out of the package, it wanted to cling to my fingers, but after a few seconds of kneading, it became much softer, smoother, and surprisingly easy to shape. At this point, I realized I had been a little bit optimistic about the size of my project. The kit includes 12 ounces of clay, which is perfect for the smaller projects shown in the idea guide, but my giant crayon wall pocket was asking for a lot more material than I originally expected. To keep it real, I plan on going to Michael's to pick up another container of the same air-dry clay. Once the parts were shaped, I cut the opening that would eventually sit behind the peeled paper wrapper and hold a small arrangement of flowers. Now comes the hardest part, waiting for everything to dry. I'll be back in part 2 to assemble and paint. In part 1, I used the Crayola Air-Dry Clay Paint and Sculpt Pack to start a project I've wanted to make for a long time, a giant crayon wall pocket. However, I underestimated the amount of clay that I needed to use, so I went back to Michael's to get some more. After several days of drying, it was finally time to see if this thing survived and turn it into something resembling my original sketch. I began the project with 2 parts, however, I quickly realized I needed to make it 3 parts in order to reinforce the edges. Overall, the pieces held their shape surprisingly well. I did end up with some cracking, but I'm calling this one user error. I kept adding clay, smoothing it with water, changing things, and generally refusing to leave it alone, so this poor crayon went through an awful lot. Once everything was completely dry, I used sanding blocks and a Dremel tool to smooth some of the rough areas and refine the shape. Neither of these items come with the kit, but remember, I've taken a beginner clay kit and somehow turned it into a construction project. Next came the paint. I used the paint included in the kit, but once again, I had underestimated how enormous my project had become. I eventually needed more green, so I supplemented the kit with additional Crayola tempera paint. Just like the extra clay I had to purchase, it's really important to mention, this kit gives you plenty for the kinds of projects pictured on the box. I just apparently have no concept of scale. After several layers of green tempera, I covered it with gloss varnish to make it look waxy. After the varnish had dried, it came to the part that I thought would be easy, the wrapper. My original plan was to make it look like someone had torn open the paper wrapper, revealing a little hole for a vase underneath. I tried, and eventually realized the paper was absolutely not interested in participating in my vision. So, instead, plan B. Instead of forcing it, I embraced the opening I'd already created in the clay and let the flowers come directly out of the crayon. I was still able to use my handmade paper wrapper, complete with the classic serpentine design, which also conveniently covered some of those cracks from my adventures in overworking the clay. I added my flowers and voila! So, can this Crayola kit help me create a piece I've always wanted to make? I think the answer is yes, but I also think it's important to be transparent about what that means. I used the majority of the materials in the kit, but my project also required additional clay, additional paint, sculpting tools, sanding blocks, a Dremel, the paper wrapper I handmade, and a glossy top coat. That's definitely not a criticism of the kit. My project was simply much larger and more complicated than the projects this box was designed for. What I really like about this kit is that it gave me a starting point. It got me sculpting, it got me experimenting, and it finally got an idea that had been sitting in my head out in the real world. It isn't exactly what I originally drew, but I made this, and I'm genuinely proud of it. Sometimes I think that's the best thing an art supply can do.